The majority of our stroke patients, as you know, end up in rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is often the most prolonged phase of their inpatient stay and often outpatient follow-up. To help us traverse that journey today and new research in it is one of Australasia's leaders in rehabilitation and research, Professor Julie Bernhardt, who we're delighted to have with us, the head of the AVERT Early Rehabilitation Research Group at the Florey, and an expert in the delivery of rehabilitation to stroke patients. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for being with us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
I'm particularly pleased that although this morning Russ demoted me to Associate Professor, you have promoted me to being the Director of the NHMRC. And so anyone who wants a grant, just come and see me. I'm very excited about that one. I also want to thank Chris Bladen for recognising the importance of stroke recovery and for being an acute neurologist who has actually read some information about recovery, which is terrific. So thank you, Chris. And he's becoming quite educated around the challenges that we have. And that's not to say that people don't recognise the enormous challenge of rehabilitation and recovery. It is such a big, big field. And it extends from immediately after someone has a stroke out to many years into the future. And that makes it a very complex space for us to work in. But one of the things that I hope you, if you're rehabilitation people, really heard this morning is that when you have treatments that make miraculous change to someone's outcome, such as thrombolysis, such as clot retrieval, and also such as fever sugar swallowing, what happens is that the services change to accommodate these evidence-based treatments. So hear that. It's so, so critical. So what I'm going to talk about in my session is a lot of research, because what I want to say to you is for rehab and recovery, we need to find the game-changing treatment. If we find the game-changing treatment that can really improve someone's recovery beyond what we can currently achieve, that will change care. And we will be forced to make really significant changes to how we organise and deliver our services. So I'm not going to talk to you about the pragmatics of rehabilitation delivery, and I'm also going to say that a lot of people don't get rehab, and I work in acute, so I know that so many of our patients don't get the opportunity to even go. But let's talk about timing and dose of therapy in stroke. The fundamental research questions that we still have is who recovers, who doesn't, and why? Why is it that some of our patients do incredibly well and some people do not? And it is not just their baseline NIHSS, although that is something that is highly predictive of someone's outcome. Of course, the next layer to that is what works for who and when. And in that we start to get questions around how much, how do we schedule it, how long should it go for, and what is it that we should be delivering. So many of our current approaches are pragmatic. So reflect back on what I said earlier, which is that to get game-changing treatments, we actually have to be much bolder and not talk just about pragmatics. We have to talk about finding things that really work. So when I talk about therapy dose, those of us who work in the space know that it is made up of a lot of different elements. It's not one simple thing. When we're applying treatments, it's not just the amount, or the frequency, or the duration, or the intensity, or the schedule, or the titration. It's a combination of all of these things. And this is what makes rehabilitation research so incredibly complex. It is not, I will give you a pill and give you that pill every day. It is, I will give you the treatment X times a day in whatever way it's meant, and we titrate it. And obviously the tidier guidelines have been very helpful in sort of getting us to focus on elements. Now, Chris also did mention that we've got a ways to go in terms of how we design our research. And I am going to expose our underwear for a few minutes while I talk about some of the state of training trials. Now, this is something that's just come out. Karen Borschman led this review, which looked at Cochrane reviews of any treatment that you could call rehab training. It excluded drug trials and it excluded device trials, but anything that we typically would be delivering as therapists to our patients. What we did was we took all the Cochrane reviews that were current up to 2013 or 2014, and then we extracted every single randomised controlled trial out of those trials. We included them if there were randomised controlled trials, and we pulled them out with full text articles. We ended up out of those Cochrane reviews with 194 discrete clinical trials. Now, this is where intervention commencement happens. So I'm talking about timing. So as you can see from this slide, that a lot of the trials that are currently done are after 12 months. So we're starting to do trials that are in 12 months' time after someone's had their acute stroke. There's also some that are happening in the early phase, but you can see that there's a large distribution across here. Only 8 trials out of these 194 started within 7 days of stroke onset. Now, I'm going to tell you, of course, that you already know that the average length of stay if someone has an acute stroke is 5 days. And only a third of those people after that will actually get to rehab. So we've got this real difficult conundrum. I'll come back to this later. Our median is 152 days after someone's had a stroke. These are, by and large, pragmatic trials. Let's do a trial when we can get someone. Not let's do a trial when we really need to test that this is the intervention. Here's the kicker, and one of the things that we've got to work on. Only 31% of trials talked about the biological rationale for why they delivered the intervention in that way. Remember here, I'm talking about things that are going to be game-changing for brain repair and recovery. So I'm not talking here about things that are pragmatically related to how someone can live their life. And I'm not downplaying that. Anyone who's a stroke survivor knows that they want people interested in those things. Just remember that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the game-changing pieces. Most of our research, we don't even bother to talk about what the biological rationale might be for the intervention. And we typically use the things like, it will maximise plasticity, which is just a catch cry for, we know the brain changes, but that's not really good enough, right? Now, when we look at the improvement in quality, so this is one of the analyses that we did, and this is the association between reporting. I'm just going to, I'll use this one. No. Oh, the top one. Got it, thank you. Oop, but I'll go back. So this is the odds of the association between reporting of quality item and publication year. So it is showing that we are getting better. Was the dose intensity reported? Only in about 35% of trials. Dose justified, 18% of trials. So that's talking about the dose parts. Do we even try and justify why we've picked that dose? Oh, it's more, or it's different, or it's not, we haven't really spent the effort to justify. And the actual intervention, talking about whether it was whether we checked compliance and whether or not it was reported. Pretty dismal, some of this stuff, right? Now, these were out to 2013, as I said, and we are showing that over time this is improving. But here are the median dose characteristics that are shown in these trials. So this is ADL, walking, cardiovascular training, cognition, motor, speech and language, upper limb training. Look at this for the median. This is the frequency of the intervention, the number of days per week. This is the session length. This is the number of sessions. And this is the weeks of intervention. What I want you to notice is that there's a lot of consistency. So it doesn't matter if we're doing cognition or speech or motor or cardiovascular, we're pretty much going, that'll be good. And that is 50 minutes a day, 3 times a week for 6 weeks. So that's what we're picking. So we have to ask ourselves, is that really a good reason to choose those doses? And we need to think about how we address this better. So, of course, we have the is more better question. And this is a review that came out from Keith Loesch et al., and also Catherine Lang, again in 2015. It's a meta-analysis of 1,750 participants across a number of different trials, and it included 30 studies. The main thing I want you to see here is that the blue is control groups. So this is the dose, and then the experimental groups are shown in the pinky colour. So their conclusion with this, and ignore the little A1, B1, that's just whether they're doing constraint or different modes of treatment. I just want you to get the gestalt for this one. And this is estimated time scheduled for therapy as well. And that's because we often don't report therapy very well. So this is time with a therapist, which is not time doing active therapy. And that's one of the things we have to change as well. But you can see here that there is an improvement in outcome as the doses are higher. So the idea that we've had for a long time with Gert Quackel's trials early on and meta-analyses that suggest that an extra 16 hours of training can make a difference, this is still coming out in our existing literature. But I just want to pick up on some work that Kate Hayward has been doing. Kate's one of my postdocs and certainly a future leader in this space. And she's particularly interested in upper limb recovery. So Kate has shown that if you have a severe stroke, on average you get 6 minutes of treatment per day. If you have a moderate to severe stroke, you might get 18 minutes of treatment per day. Gert Quackel, in his systematic review, has gone up from 16 hours overall to saying we need 38 minutes. We start to see some improvement in upper limb recovery if it's applied on a daily basis. But then here's the 2016 Schneider work, which is suggesting that really the kind of dose we're needing to find to show improvement is 2 hours plus a day. Again, keep your pragmatic lenses off. Don't go, oh, but we can't possibly do that. Remember, we're trying to find things that radically improve people's outcome beyond what we can expect from usual standard care and recovery. So when Gert Quackel then did his explicit trial, he was using an hour a day and showed only really not much change between control and active intervention. When Carolee Winstein did her eye care trial, they did an hour per day. And that wasn't really enough either. That was a neutral trial. And Catherine Lang, in a smaller study, did between 27 and 54 minutes per day and also had a neutral effect. So 2 hours plus is what's seeming to be really the ballpark for trying to get some change. Now, when we look at upper limb training dose and timing, then here's some other data that looks really interesting. So this is change on the Fugl-Meyer, and the Fugl-Meyer is an important measure of impairment for people who are not familiar with anything beyond the modified Rankin scale. That was not really a dig, I just thought that was funny. So in the Fugl-Meyer, what we see here in the hand study is in patients with severe, moderate and mild stroke, that if you have a 3-hour training, there's an 18-point change on the Fugl-Meyer, and that's in people in the acute and subacute phase. And that's higher than if you just do an hour a day. And 18 points is really significant for a change, right? In subacute, this is work by Nick Ward et al. It's not published yet, but they are doing a 6-hour-a-day protocol in people coming into their service. And in that 6 hours, they can see on average a 10-point gain on the Fugl-Meyer, which has important implications for function. And then the McCabe study in severe stroke patients in the chronic phase is again showing like a 5 hours a day of training that can make a difference. What's important here is that when you're in the acute and subacute phase, it's 3 hours, a smaller amount of training that can lead to a larger amount of impact compared to usual care. So this is now getting us into the timing dose interaction piece. Now, I'm not going to talk much about early mobility training. I am talking about that this afternoon. So what I'm going to say from the AVERT experience, so from our early mobility protocol, is that we have probably what we see is this inverted U-shaped curve around recovery. And don't forget there's a timing interaction as well. From our data, if you do too little, then you're not going to get much recovery. If you do too much, you're not going to get the right recovery. And there's probably a just right in the middle, but the just right will differ for different people. The other thing I'll say is that we are moving on to the next trial, avert dose, which I'll talk about again this afternoon. So we're still trying to work out the right dose for people in acute care. So getting back to the fundamental rehab questions, the who recovers, who doesn't, why, and what works for who when. So these are all these interactions. So this is one of the papers from our first roundtable that Chris mentioned. So this was about agreed definitions and a shared vision. It was fascinating to run this first international roundtable with 60 experts, and one of the first things we realised is that we didn't agree on the definitions. And so the first thing we had to do was define what we meant when we talked about recovery. What do we mean by recovery? What's compensation versus restoration? Do we just want compensation? Or are we really aiming for restoration? Are we aiming for brain repair, restoration? And that's really where we need to aim for. Anyway, this is one of the things that we also need to agree on. What do we call time? Now, these are the time windows, the phases that we've identified, and we're going to try and use these when we describe treatments. And this is the hyperacute phase, and then acute phase, early subacute, late subacute, and chronic phase. And they are actually aligned with some biological processes which largely come from from animal and preclinical work, but also from some clinical work. So what is the right time? Well, what we know is that in the early phase, so around here, that people are in a phase of rapid change, and that is potentially a really good window for us to be working on. So why is the early time window favoured? Well, we see large biological processes that change, that are coming from preclinical work, as I said. There is significant evidence that the brain is in a rapid phase of change, and that there's some certain things that are happening then that might favour us starting our interventions. And I recommend the book by John Krakauer and Tom Carmichael that's just come out called The Broken Brain. It's a really great book. We still don't know, though, really what the optimal time window is. So is it out to 60 days, out to 90 days? Is it earlier? We really don't know. We do know that the first 2 days is a time for us to be cautious and for us to think about how we deliver our interventions. But what we also know is that people have learned disuse really fast, that they compensate really quickly, and if we leave it too late, they have fixed movement patterns and maladaptive plasticity. Plasticity is not always good. People do have maladaptive change, and once that happens, then we have to unlearn it all, and that's really tough. We also know that people get contractures and other secondary effects, which are very difficult. And we also know that if we start really late, then people's whole approach to their own recovery can be significantly affected. So the early time window is important. But should we care about early onset training? In the motor phase, absolutely. So there are distinct windows where we see people making change in their motor control system. And this paper, which is Tomoko Katago, who's a really dynamic young physician who's interested in recovery in the US, shows beautifully how you can have changes in motor control function only up to a certain time point, and you can still have strength changing after that, but it's really about 5 weeks where people start to integrate and convert back to motor control patterns that are more normal if you can get that happening. So I talked a bit about the 194 trials here and the early window. I'm now going to just talk briefly about where really our research is sitting. Now, this was a review that I did in 2017 that tried to searched so many databases, 24,000 trials, and just to show you again, this is it. This is the handful of studies that are starting early after stroke. So we're not doing many, and I'm not going to talk about Erin's work because she'll be talking about it later. But it fits in there. And then here are the other studies that came from the earlier review. So we have a ways to go in making sure that we're tackling this issue. I'm going to finish by talking about what are we missing. Well, we're missing carefully designed trials of biologically informed interventions that test our assumptions about dose and timing. And I'm going to talk about dose finding and dose escalation approaches, because these are some of the things that we're exploring as part of trying to really unpack some of this work. So we decided a couple of years ago to try a dose escalation trial. Now, you might have heard of these. They are often done in cancer trials, drug trials. They're sort of phase 1 studies where you're starting to try and look at toxicity of a drug. But the model is quite a nice model to contemplate. This is where you take small groups of people and you run a particular dose of something into them as part of the intervention, and you monitor them carefully and look at what's going to happen. They are rule-based studies, and you're looking for dose-limiting events or toxicity. The events are based on these toxicity outcomes. The first one we tried was in chronic stroke, in people with mobility impairment. So they were in the community but not community walking, quite disabled, and we decided to try and do an exercise study using this approach. And Wayne Dyett led that work, which was a lot of fun to do. Now, when we did the phase 1 study for the exercise, we actually started at too high a dose, so we didn't end up doing as many escalations, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But we did get some people exercising up to 10 hours a week, which was amazing for that group. So we've adapted these to non-pharmacological trials. So in this new work with Sharon Kramer, which is much earlier, we're using 5 by 5 by 5 instead of 3 groups of 3. We are also stratifying, because stratifying is something we have to really address, and biological stratification, other stratification is essential in this area. And we need phases of familiarisation and adaptation as part of how you design these studies. But for us, in this exercise space, when we're talking about toxicity, we're talking about over-exercising criteria. So I'll show you this from Sharon's work. So this is people doing the strata that we have, the moderate exercise capacity group and the low exercise capacity group. So we put them through an exercise test, and then we put them into one of the cohorts of 5. And then we're running our adaptation and then our exercise interventions, and we're looking for these dose-limiting events. And this is what can happen when you're doing these dose escalation studies. You can have your 5 people here, all of them do really well in the first cohort, and so that group and this one as well are going to go on, and we're going to escalate now into the next one. For this group, we need to try it again and see if they're the same dose. We need to have another group of people and check that we're sitting at 3. If there's a lot more people that have dose-limiting events, then we've probably got it wrong and we might be starting too high and have to go backwards. But this is a nice way of conceptualising it. So if they do well, and these ones, we can move into cohort 2 and we can start to do higher dose intervention. So at the moment, Sharon's into the 3rd tier of this, and we're managing to escalate people up into higher doses of exercise interventions. And we will keep going until we get to the maximum dose tolerable. Now, this is a systematic way that we can approach how we try and increase the doses of what we're doing and observe carefully. And I think that this is something that we need to continue to progress with. And then finally, the other question that, as I've talked about, dose, time and the who piece, which have to be explored, is this early versus late comparison. So I did say to you that it looks like the early window is important, but that's an assumption based on a lot of biological evidence, but we actually have never proven it in humans. There's some preclinical work suggesting that we do early and late, and that the early groups are always better in preclinical animal work. Very, very rarely do we see benefit in starting interventions later in the animals. But in humans, we've never really looked at this, and we do know that lots of people do lots of training. And so what we have here is an important study that Kate is leading that is looking at delivering over 2 hours of training every day of the week in people straight after they've had a stroke, or within 8 days they start, and doing that for over a month, so for 42 days, in that critical window where it says we should be delivering treatment. And we're then going to compare that to people who are doing exactly the same intervention but starting much later. And by doing this kind of exploratory studies, we should be able to see what that window looks like and whether or not this 2 hour a day intervention is the right kind of ballpark. So my final thoughts are pragmatic approaches won't help us develop game-changing treatments. I think that's a really important thing for us to know. But with the Stroke Recovery Roundtable group and now our International Stroke Recovery and Rehabilitation Alliance, which has kicked off as part of that, I think we are moving forward on the right track, and there's very exciting times ahead. And we know how to do better trials, and we're asking better questions. So I think we are the junior folk in this space. We're the teenagers growing up, but we're getting into a really interesting ballsy period where we're determined to make a difference, and I think that's a very exciting thing ahead. So thank you very much. Thanks to all my team, and keep in touch.